In this lecture, we're going to look at the repercussions of World War I on the design fields. The key ideas presented in this lecture will be seen in later materials as well, since this was such a pivotal period for modern architecture. First, a little bit of background. So, World War I was fought between July 28, 1914 and November 11, 1918, and was known at the time as the Great War, the War to End War, and in the United States it was called the European War. Only when the world went to war again in 1930 and 40s did the earlier conflict become known as the First World War. The casualties of this war were unprecedented, soaring into the millions. World War I is known for the extensive system of trenches from which men of both sides fought. Lethal new technologies were unleashed, and for the first time a major war was fought not only on land and on sea, but also below the sea and in the skies as well, with planes and submarines. Gases and chemical warfare were also used for the first time. The two sides were known as the Allies, consisting primarily of France, Great Britain, Italy, Russia, and later, joining the war quite a bit later, the United States. And then on the other side, the Central Powers, comprised of Austria-Hungary, the Habsburg Empire, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. A number of smaller nations aligned themselves with one side or the other. In the Pacific, Japan, seeing a chance to seize German colonies, threw in with the Allies. Of course, as you know, the Allies were ultimately the victors, and the entry of the United States into the war in 1917 gave the additional weight of men and material to the Central Powers could not match. The war resulted in a dramatically changed geopolitical landscape, including the destruction of three empires, the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian. New borders were drawn at the conclusion of World War I, and many resentments followed, especially on the part of Germany, but other areas in Europe as well. Ironically and terribly, decisions made after the fighting ceased in World War I led and were significant to the start of the Second World War a couple of decades later. So what were the consequences of World War I for the development of modern architecture? Well, one thing, of course, was rebuilding. So here we can see the devastation of Hôtel de Ville during the war. So rebuilding efforts were paramount. There was also a tremendous housing shortage, as soldiers returning from war were more likely to stay in urban areas. Now, within the architectural field, many modern architects were actually soldiers in their 20s and early 30s, pretty formative periods in any individual's life. And so how did active service in the trenches or behind the front line, travel to foreign lands, so exposure to new architectures, for example, and the communal experience of danger influence their thinking about their work, their profession, their goals, their morality, and even society at large? As early as 1917, the psychologist Kurt Lewin published seminal texts about how the soldier's experience of the battlefield fundamentally changed his perception of space. In literature, reflections on the horrors and extraordinary experiences of the Great War followed 10 years later in masterpieces by many writers. Yet in the realm of architecture, little seems to be known beyond anecdotal tales that Walter Gropius was buried underneath rubble, and that Ludwig Mies van der Rohe's military career was modest, due to the lack of university education. There are, however, technologies, methodologies, and theoretical concerns in the development of modern architecture after 1918 that can be traced back to the war experience. It's difficult to make a sort of a direct response to these kinds of questions, and it's certainly layered. But let's look at some of the repercussions now. So in an earlier lecture, we talked about the Deutscher Werkbund, and it was founded before World War I, as you can see in 1907. But post-World War I Germany, the Weimar Republic, saw a drastic change not only in the economy, but also in government, art, and architecture. And this group, the Deutscher Werkbund, which had sought change even before the war started, continued to feed this idea that rapid industrialization and modernization in Germany posed a threat to national culture unless it was well harnessed. As we already have learned, it was a group of artists and manufacturers who got together. About 100 people in all were in attendance at one of the early meetings. And because both artists and entrepreneurs attended, it was anticipated that the Werkbund would succeed in bringing both artistic and ethical elements to Germany's economic life. And as we learned already too, its immediate task was to improve the design and quality of German consumer goods. Well, these ideas, while stalled somewhat during the worst parts of the war, were relaunched and focused even more precisely at the end of the war. And as we'll see in the next few slides, the primary focus of the Werkbund moved to housing and accommodation, because this is where it was felt the impact of good design could be most felt by the general public. There's a housing shortage, and it's through housing that one could form and shape a new generation of Germans. One of the exhibitions aimed at improving production and housing was the Waisenhaus Siedlungen. So in the late 1920s, the German economy is slowly gaining steam after the inflationary crisis of the early 20s. Housing projects sponsored by municipal and state governments and cooperative building societies began to be built all over Germany. So this is just one example. To support these efforts, the Deutscher Werkbund, at that time under a pro-modernist leadership, sponsored an exhibition of houses to be designed by architects from all over Europe, with Stuttgart chosen as the site because of the progressive politics of its regional government. Ludwig Mies van der Rohe headed the project, which was slated to open in 1927. What was presented to the world when it opened was not just Mies van der Rohe's own vision, but an entire housing estate called a Siedlung, dedicated to modernist thinking. For us as historians, we can see the Waisenhaus Siedlung as a showcase of modernism in architecture, as seen from the eyes of international contemporary architects. The estates of the Waisenhaus exhibition in 1927 were model homes, really, model homes of a new way of construction that promoted a better living for its residents. 17 architects from 5 different countries created 21 homes in Stuttgart. And if you look at this list of homes, you'll remember from HDE2 many of these names: J.J.P. Oud, M. Stamm, Le Corbusier, Peter Behrens, Walter Gropius, Ludwig Hilbersheimer, Mies van der Rohe, Hans Scharoun, Bruno Taut, Max Taut. These are all, it's like a who's who of modernist designers. Mies organized the buildings in a loose rectangular composition above a broad S-shaped road that follows the slope of the land, and he placed the taller buildings at the top so that each residence would have vistas. To create a unified image, an ensemble, there were some parameters within which all the architects had to work. They all had to employ flat roofs and white facades. Included in the exhibition were row houses, duplexes, single-family houses, and apartment buildings. It can't be underscored enough that the Weissenhof-Siedlung marked a turning point in the history of modernism. And though the movement is hardly uniform, there are important differences among its leading members, the exhibition created for the public, and indeed for the architects themselves, the appearance of a common mission. It also attracted a good deal of criticism by various defenders of traditional architecture, and it visibly demarcated the contested and confusing boundary between modern and traditionalists that exists really until this day. So these were prototypes. They were models that were designed to exhibit innovative solutions for the housing shortage after the war, a clear repercussion of World War I. And the city of Stuttgart, why would it sponsor this project? Well, it was a way of conveying a democratic approach of construction, a way of promoting progressive design for the masses. The Weissenhof primarily addressed the working and middle classes. The states showed unity in design, as you can see in this bird's eye image, in their arrangement, because they're all organized around each other and have the same minimalistic style. Then when you zoom in a little more and allow your eyes to rest on the individual elements, taking a closer look, you can see a range, as there is some variety here. There's the use of geometry, but not identical geometries. There are no decorative ornaments, however, and everything is painted white. So, obeying the ideal of standardization and rationalization. Ah, yes, rationalism again. The three homes designed by Walter Gropius, Peter Behrens, and Mark Stamm each propose quite different solutions. And we'll look at a couple of these in more detail. So this is the building that Mies van der Rohe designed for the exhibition. It's an apartment block. It's the earliest use of structural steel in an apartment building in Europe. The steel allowed Mies to create thin, non-load-bearing walls on the interior. And as would become typical for him, he combined the walls that contained the water and plumbing pipes with stairwell walls, so that you had these cores that repeated on every floor. This is a brilliant sort of simple compression and unification of structure, space, and function. You can see that here in plan. It's an elongated building, allowing lots of light along each side. There are 24 apartments with 6 different designs, laid out over 4 floors. And there are terraces set aside for laundry and storage areas. You can see a very clear rhythm to the facade. It's nested along the slope of the ground, but the building itself is not necessarily aware of its context. And by that I mean it is somewhat generic. There you can see it on the left. And on the right, I'm showing you the interior of Marcel Breuer's apartment. You'll notice the modern furnishings there. Now, Walter Gropius, and I'm not showing you his project here, but at his project, he, of course, would go on to found the Bauhaus. He implemented the innovation of prefabrication. So his single-family house has the look of an off-white painted box. So prefabrication, modular systems, rational approaches to design. The modular system he proposed not only implemented innovative materials and allowed a quicker fabrication, it was also modifiable to the needs of any commission. So it did have some flexibility. And part of this for Gropius is that he stressed that the Bauhaus, his institution, its role, and the architect's role and importance in constructing a new social environment. The significance of the Weissenhof exhibition is that it depicts more than just one individual artist, one vision of utopia, of contemporary housing. Instead, it's kind of a manifestation of all the different thinking of the modernist movement at that time. The international flair of the individual contributions reminds of the exchange of artistic ideas from artists from the Netherlands, Germany, and other areas across Europe. Even though the buildings claim to be responses of the contemporary needs of the working class, ultimately they really addressed more the middle class. Mies van der Rohe had allowed a wide artistic freedom to the individual contributors, and it results in dwellings that are more artwork really than science-based engineering. So those are some of the criticism. The new materials and technologies were applied, ones like mass production, modular systems, prefabrication, coming out of World War I. But functionalism was a guideline for design, not a doctrine. For the rest of the lecture, we're going to look at this idea of expressionism. Expressionism is a term that arises in the early 20th century around a group of painters. They were mainly German, and they were centered in Munich. And they sought to convey deep emotional content using significant amounts of abstraction, but without losing figural subject matter. Color played a major role in their work, and they also sought to convey a new and different kind of emotional content, often verging on complex psychology and psychic struggle. It's important to remember that during the same time, the work of Sigmund Freud was very new and groundbreaking, suggesting that many undercurrents in the personality determine human emotional and psychological reaction and a variety of situational archetypes. While expressionism in architecture may not have quite so much Freudian content, there is abundant evidence that many architects at least went through a period in which they hoped to make architecture more emotionally expressive than a machine or industrial aesthetic would permit. So this is a good place to remind you of that tension in the Deutscher Werkbund between norm and form. So form would be more expressionist, and norm would be more about the industrial and machine aesthetic. Expressionism is not a clearly defined term, and certainly I have seen multiple definitions. It can often overlap with other kinds of content and formal choices. Nevertheless, there's a certain quality about it that usually allows us to recognize it as being expressionist. Expressionist forms are often sculptural, sometimes irrational, usually personal and idiosyncratic. But they are also often distorted. The notion of identifying expressive qualities in a building is not necessarily the same as identifying impressionistic qualities. A building may convey some intentional meaning through its form, it's expressive, or the stamp of the personality, individuality, identity, or even the pathology of the architect, expressionistic. This may not be always so easy to distinguish. A wildly sculptural form may not always be evidence of expressionism. Ah yeah, so confusing. However, what I want you to take in here in these next examples is that expressionistic form can also convey spirituality as well as psychology. And that in expressionism in the early 20th century, there's a very particular way that the emotional content was meant to be revealed. One of the very interesting ideas to emerge out of early 20th century expressionism is this idea of the glass chain. The glass chain, it's also sometimes called the crystal chain, and it's also sometimes called the utopian correspondence, was essentially a chain letter that was written between November 1919 and December 1920. And it was a series of letters that passed between architects, specific architects who formed the basis of Expressionist architecture in Germany. And it was started by an individual called Bruno Taut. Now you'll notice that on this list here of people involved in the glass chain, of these, only 2 were not involved in the Deutscher Werkbund's housing project that we just looked at in Stuttgart. So this is a very small, tight group who are working on many individual projects together. One person not on that list is Paul Scheerbart, and he was an artist also involved. This is what he says. In order to raise our culture to a higher level, we are forced, whether we like it or not, to change our architecture. And this will only be possible if we free the rooms in which we live from their enclosed character. This, however, we can only do by introducing a glass architecture, which admits the light of the sun, of the moon, and of the stars, not only through a few windows, but through as many walls as feasible. These to consist entirely of glass, of colored glass. Bruno Taut, an active architect working in this period, this idea of glass, of the crystal, became a sort of spiritual manifestation of many of his social ideas. And he wrote a series of books. He had some utopian plans and drawings. You can see here at the top right, sort of crystal that would light up a cityscape. And so they took this idea of the crystal quite literally, and it had symbolic meaning and intention as well. To reinforce this idea, here's a quote from Adolf Benny. It's not the crazy caprice of a poet that glass architecture will bring a new culture. It is a fact. New social welfare organizations, hospitals, inventions, or technical innovations and improvements. These will not bring a new culture, but glass architecture will. Therefore, the European is right when he fears that glass architecture might become uncomfortable. Certainly it will be so, and that is not its least advantage. The European must be wrenched out of his coziness. Now, what is that coziness that Benny is referring to here? Well, this is the idea that new social improvements, the idea that a new society, a modern progressive society could be created, would be difficult for the European who was stuck in the past, stuck in traditional norms, and that this kind of change, the change that was needed, would not be comfortable for everyone. So how is this expressionism actually realized in design? So, not surprisingly, we're going to take another look at the impact of the Werkbund. This was a project at the Werkbund exhibition in Cologne in 1914, right at the outbreak of World War I. And this is Bruno Taut's glass house under construction. Taut's glass house was displayed in the Cologne exhibition, again organized by the Werkbund. The original structure was actually commissioned not by the Werkbund, but rather by the glass industry. The glass industry wanted an architecture that would display its new wares. The glass house itself posed the problem that it's hard to reconcile the steel and glass constructive modernity with strong 19th century craftsmanship, especially around the interior room's cascading waterfall and colorful spectacle created by the glass works on the wall. As Franz Schwarz puts it, the technical innovation clashed with the, quote, crystal mysticism, unquote, that was the central aspect of the design. But this is in fact what the attempt was to do, is to bring these two things together. The phrase above the door that you can see in the elevation drawing there, it says in German, quote, "The Gothic cathedral is the prelude to glass architecture," unquote. So Taut's building was meant to be an experience of light afforded by a combination of glass and skeletal metal structure that would rival or at least remind one of the wonders of the Gothic. The building itself was a result of the exchange of ideas between Taut and the poet Paul Scherbert, I mentioned earlier. These ideas, while not in line with a sense of technical utopia, describe the building as a poetic utopia, a utopia in the form of glowing crystalline glass in architecture. The design of the building led visitors down a carefully constructed path of stairs, which gave glimpses outside to the real world through transparent glass, before going to a glowing, colorful realm characterized by upper and lower rooms of the building. In essence, it became both a pageant for the glowing crystal and an advertisement for the glass industry and the exhibition in Cologne. A mixing of art and commerce. The building itself was dedicated to Scherbart. The small scale was inspired by late Gothic chapels, and the dome itself recalls Islamic mosques. As Detlef Martens described the pavilion itself, it was a symbol of a return to, quote, organic society, unquote, or to art itself, in the form of criticism of European humanism. It is theming poverty and advocating the return to primitivism, quote, through which the creative power of the masses will awaken, unquote. A little side note here, Walter Gropius himself took an interest in Scherbart's writings as well, and this was indicated through the incorporation of Scherbart's, quote, crystal iconography, unquote, which Gropius incorporated into the Bauhaus Manifesto that he wrote in April 1919. Interestingly, that same text, the Manifesto for the Bauhaus, reveals a model for handicraft and communal work, otherwise known as emphasis on the creation of prototypes. And this was a common practice for which the Bauhaus became very well known. Some other images of the glass house and its crystalline structure. You can see the upper room, everything was glass and steel. The floor had glass so that light could go into the lower level. The mysticism of moving up with this glass block wall. We don't have any color photographs here, but there was a great richness of color in the upper area, so that one felt as though you're really within the middle of a kaleidoscope or color globe. Another architect of importance within Expressionism is Erich Mendelsohn. Mendelsohn, as a designer, turned out countless drawings that are essentially thumbnail sketches of buildings based on the expressive capacity of form. The sketches, the line in the sketches, just seems to move. And his buildings realize much of this movement as well. Mendelssohn also found music to be a major source of inspiration for his work, and he made drawings that in essence express the content of specific musical works. He may well have taken the words of the poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe quite literally when Goethe said, quote, "Architecture is frozen music," unquote. One of Mendelssohn's most celebrated buildings in the Expressionist mode is the Einstein Tower, located in Potsdam, just outside of Berlin. It was built in 1920 to 24. This is an observation, or an observatory, named in honor of Albert Einstein, and originally intended to be created in reinforced concrete construction. And you can see from its lines, and it's a very sort of sculptural quality, that it would have done quite well in reinforced concrete. However, Mendelssohn's vision surpassed the technical and economic ability to create this at this time. So it was actually built of brick masonry. Mendelssohn's studies, you can see some of those sketches on the right here, for the Einstein Tower indicate the dynamism of the forms he was envisioning. But a comparison with the built form indicates how difficult it is to translate this expressionism into solid materials. Of the different expressionist designers, however, he probably comes the closest. It's very, very sculptural. Because of the stucco coating, it looks almost though it's carved. And the long swooping lines are ones that he would carry into other projects as well. For example, his department store in Chemnitz, Germany. Mendelssohn was fascinated by the power of light in architecture, and so here we see the sweeping curve is in the facade of a department store. The modernist composition is very interesting. So the long horizontal lines, the very systematic, sort of prefabricated modular qualities of the elevation, very, very modern. But the effects at night, so this is where the expressionism comes in. The effects at night are quite stunning, with the long lines of lit windows swooping around the corner and down the street. And this is another department store in Breslau, Poland, which again takes that idea of movement and the long line and the use of light and darkness to create this very strong expression in the architecture. And here you can see, even in his sketch for that project, the dynamism of it. So potent. A later example of an expressionist structure is Hans Scharoun's Berlin Philharmonic. And you'll notice this is quite a bit later. This is in the 50s and it was finished in the 60s. But I'm just mentioning it here because it's very tempting to see architectural periods as being progressive. So one starts, but then it ends, then the next one starts, the next one, etc. And that's absolutely not the case. We're going to see different threads through the 20th century that ebb and flow, but there might be continuous moments or continuous expressions, and that is definitely true of Expressionism. This particular building, the Berlin Philharmonic, was completed in 1963, and we see Scharoun's organic and futuristic aesthetic as interpreted for a concert hall. And it was a replacement for a previous Philharmonic hall that was destroyed in World War II. Scharoun's design was fairly straightforward in that it focused on placing music at the center of the design, both conceptually and physically. And so from the center, music would be amplified and filtered throughout the auditorium. And as an architect, Scharoun was a main proponent of organic expressionist architecture, and he wanted to create a balance and harmony between nature and architecture. And so here, part of that nature is the music and the quality of sound. The program here is very direct, so 2 music halls, a main auditorium, and then a smaller chamber music hall. But it's really not the program that is most interesting here. It's how Scharoun, what he does spatially with the program to create this very dynamic presence. So here we see some of the stairs. You can see his use of angles. You can get a sense of the way he saw music being expressed in space. And here we can see again. And so the building is programmatically simple. Formally, the Berlin Philharmonic is complex in that the expressive interior spaces are reflected on the exterior of the building. So the draping that you see here in the ceiling, the angular composition, are carried into the formal design of each hall's volume. The angles and the swooping tent-like structure create a playful yet contained aesthetic that really complements the interior spatial conditions. One of the most fascinating and important architects that are usually associated with Expressionism is Rudolf Steiner. And he was a man who called himself a spiritual scientist. He was born in Austria-Hungary, and he was educated at the University of Vienna. And he edited the scientific works of the German Romantic poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And in his research on Goethe, he became aware of Goethe's theory of color and also his plant studies that led to the concept of metamorphosis. So metamorphosis is a pretty seductive concept. So while some scientists believed that Goethe's color theory was unscientific, especially compared to the theory of color as refracted light, Steiner argued that the poetic truth of Goethe's ideas held up under laboratory conditions, and thus for him, and for many, had compelling value that supersedes initial impression. Similarly, the theory of plant metamorphosis, which has generally had more credibility with botanists, is, according to Steiner, more reliable because it deals with both the physical and the metaphysical aspects of plant growth. So the mixing here of the physical and the metaphysical, right? So that poetic truth is very important to Steiner. And here's some of the sketches from Goethe's sort of plant studies. Goethe's ideas about metamorphosis was that each stage in the growth of a plant proceeded out of the previous and into the next, according to principles that suggest the seed contains its own history and its own future. So the form that's derived, in this case in the plant, is not haphazard, but obeys laws of development that are both inherent and universal. Steiner was also fascinated by the relationship between mathematics and spirituality. He taught that the visible world is the densest and most material realm of a much, much larger spiritual world, and that any human being who chose could have access to the larger spiritual world through a process of meditation, spiritual discipline, and willpower. He taught that just as we do not presume that someone somewhere earlier in history invented mathematics, but rather accept mathematics as self-justifying facts or truths, the spiritual world could be perceived in the same way. We learn mathematics by beginning with simple concepts and moving into much more complex levels. The same is true of the spiritual world. Steiner also taught that human life is metamorphic, much like the natural world, and that the greatest effort of the time was to acquire deeper knowledge of human relationships to the spiritual world. This study eventually became known as anthroposophy. Anthropos coming from man, and sophia, knowledge or wisdom. So what does this mean for design? Well, shortly after the turn of the 20th century, right towards the end of sort of World War I and towards the end of it, Steiner founded the Anthroposophical Society in Berlin. Before the outbreak of World War I, he moved the headquarters of the society to Dornach, a village outside of Basel, Switzerland. And there he began construction of a building which would house his School of Spiritual Science. This is a sectional model that you're seeing here in the image, and it shows the main auditorium and a stage where lectures and performances would be held. The model shows the north side of the building, and the columns and architrave above them express the idea of metamorphosis. Each capital and its section of the architrave bear the effects of the previous one and affect the succeeding one. The ceiling was painted in deeply saturated colors that represent the spiritual world. Construction began in 1918 and the building was completed in 1922. And ultimately, he named the Center of Spiritual Science the Goetheanum. So he took the name of Goethe and added Annum, building, Goetheanum. And this was a building dedicated to Goethe. And it was conceived as a double dome structure in which the larger dome housed the audience and the smaller dome covered the stage. The domes intersect, however, and their intersection forms an arch. The entire superstructure was made of wood. Here you can see the previous image I showed you of this was a model, but here we can see the actual completed building. Here's the building in the process of being made. The entire building was hand carved, so that the idea of metamorphosis, of moving sort of material metamorphosis from one element to the next, was truly realized. And one can actually think of the Goetheanum as really being a monumental piece of sculpture. And here's the exterior of the Goetheanum. On New Year's Eve 1922, someone set fire to the building and it burned to the ground. A second Goetheanum was planned immediately, this time in reinforced concrete. I'll show you a few images of that. The sculptural quality of this new form is immediately apparent and quite dramatic. And in fact, one might say that concrete is even better for showing that sort of metamorphosis from one element into the next than wood had been in Steiner's first building. The formal quality seems organic here and is produced by formwork that depends largely on non-Euclidean geometry. So using new sort of conceptions of math, new materials to create a very novel and expressionistic architecture. You can see some of the formwork, and again the large meeting hall, which was the key purpose of the building. Some images of the inside of the Goetheanum, the second. Notice the use of colored windows. So as with Bruno Taut and those who believed in light and colored glass and the mystical qualities of crystal, Steiner as well felt that light and colored glass, there was a purity there. There's a possibility of getting closer to spiritual truth. And here we can see some of the angles, the way the concrete elements come together, the expressed formwork on the surface of the concrete. It's not polished, so you see the process of construction remains there in the finished product. And they're together, the first Goetheanum and then the second. And a model above. So the process models for these buildings are really quite wonderful. Now in the last couple of slides, I'm going to show you a few images that might be surprising. A number of architects and artists practicing just after World War I went through periods in which their work has retrospectively been defined as expressionistic. One of those who was otherwise very rational was Mies van der Rohe. And of course, we've already discussed him in light of the Deutscher Werkbund's Waisenhofseenlungen. He was the master planner and designed that apartment building. But Mies van der Rohe was fascinated by Frank Lloyd Wright. He had worked also in the studio of Peter Behrens, and most of his early work is really in line with, in fact, actually, if you look at his very, very early work and the top image there, it's quite traditional. But then when he really entered into the profession, he worked with Behrens, he became familiar with Frank Lloyd Wright's work. His work was very much in the direction of De Stijl and functionalist architecture. And the exception of to this rule really takes place in the 1920s, and that is the glass skyscraper that he designed for the Friedrichstrasse in Berlin, and also the monument to the communist martyrs. These works venture into an area that stands apart from most of the work that Mies did before and certainly after as well. And so here are those very expressionism-based skyscraper designs, all about the expressivity of structure, revealing the line, the light, the shadow. And then here with the monument, the abstract quality of the form is balanced by the symbolic use of materials. So the bricks employed in the monument are clinkers. These are bricks that are warped or cracked during the firing process in the kiln and were rejected, just like these two martyrs, as being useless. So the materials here express something about the story and the function of the place. So in conclusion, the search for aesthetic form, we're just touching on it. We'll be talking about it for much of this course. But the search for what is the right aesthetic, and we've seen a diverse set of examples already. From the purely sort of functional oriented, the economic base of the Werkbund, and the argument between norm and form, to these expressionism examples, where the spiritual, the desire for light, in a very dark time in European history. So in conclusion, after World War I, pioneering modernist architects sought to develop a completely new style appropriate for a new post-war social and economic order. This was meant to focus on meeting the needs of the middle and working classes. How do you do this? Well, these modernist architects rejected the architectural practice of the academy, so no more historical styles, because they felt that those really addressed the aristocracy and not the middle and working classes. And the approach of many of these modernist architects was to reduce buildings to pure forms, remove historical reference, remove ornament, and really focus on functionalist details. Buildings that display their construction and structure, expose steel beams and concrete surfaces, instead of hiding them behind traditional forms. So now these new materials, these new connections, these new methods are starting to be seen as desirable in their own right. Architects such as Mies van der Rohe worked to create beauty based on the inherent qualities of building materials and modern construction techniques, trading traditional historic forms for simplified geometric forms, celebrating the new means and methods made possible by the Industrial Revolution.